George Armstrong Custer did not die because his men lacked good guns. He died while commanding soldiers equipped with a new, powerful, and accurate carbine that the United States Army believed was ideally suited for warfare in the American West. Yet in less than an hour, the 5 companies under Custer's command were wiped out at Little Bighorn. Not a single man survived to reveal which weapon Custer was holding when the circle closed around him. His famous Remington Rolling Block disappeared. The 2 British revolvers believed to have belonged to him were never conclusively identified, and the image of Custer standing on a hilltop firing a gun in each hand until his final bullet may have been nothing more than a creation of painters and the press. So what really happened? Was the Springfield Model 1873 simply too slow against the Henry and Winchester rifles carried by Lakota and Cheyenne warriors? Or did Custer place his effective weapons in a situation where no firearm could have saved him? In this video, we will separate 3 facts that are often confused: the weapons issued to the soldiers under Custer's command, the firearms Custer personally owned, and the weapons that evidence suggests he actually carried into each battle, because Custer's final bullet remains a mystery. The guns that disappeared with Custer. Look at the famous paintings of the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Custer always stands at the center, his blonde hair blowing in the wind, a gun in one hand, and the last of his soldiers fighting around him. It is a powerful and tragic image, and almost certainly not what actually happened. On June 25, 1876, George Armstrong Custer led 5 companies of the 7th Cavalry Regiment onto the hills east of the Little Bighorn River. About 210 men went with him. Not one of them survived to describe the final minutes. No one can say with certainty where Custer was standing when the formation began to collapse. No one knows what orders he gave when he was wounded, or which weapon was in his hands as Lakota and Cheyenne warriors closed the circle around him. Every story that appeared afterward was reconstructed from native accounts, evidence left on the ground, and the imaginations of people who had never been there. When reinforcements reached the battlefield, the scene before them looked nothing like the neat last stand shown in paintings. The bodies of soldiers were scattered across the hillsides, inside ravines and along ridgelines stretching for nearly a mile. Many had been stripped of their clothing, boots, ammunition belts, and weapons. The hunting rifle believed to have belonged to Custer had disappeared. The 2 British revolvers he may have carried were also gone. No sword and no personal firearm were found beside his body. That would allow history to declare that this was the weapon Custer used in his final battle. So ask yourself one question. If Custer's guns disappeared, why is he so often portrayed holding 2 revolvers? And how can historians speak about a man's final bullet when no one even knows what his final gun was? The answer lies in the void left by the dead. The press needed a hero. Painters needed a battle scene with a clear center. America, celebrating its 100th anniversary, needed an image tragic enough to transform a military defeat into a story of courage. So Custer was placed on top of the hill. He stood upright inside the circle, firing until his last bullet, while loyal soldiers fell around him. That image appeared in newspapers, advertising prints, posters, history books, and eventually movies. But more than a century later, the ground began telling a different story. In 1983, a major fire burned away the thick grass covering the Little Bighorn battlefield. When the vegetation disappeared, thousands of small pieces of metal began emerging from the dry soil. Cartridge cases, bullets, gun fragments, cavalry spurs, strap buckles, and cartridges that were never fired. Archaeologists did not simply pick them up and place them inside display cases. They marked the exact location where each artifact was found, and then placed every discovery on a map. Under microscopes, they compared firing pin impressions, breech face marks, and scratches too small to be seen with the naked eye. This allowed them to identify cartridge cases consistent with having been fired from the same weapon. Imagine that. A warrior fired several shots near Calhoun Hill, moved through a ravine, and continued firing from another position. More than 100 years later, the cases he left behind could still be connected into a path of movement across the map. Archaeology even identified approximately 47 different types of weapons used by Lakota and Cheyenne forces. There were old muzzle-loading guns. There were Civil War revolvers, Sharps rifles, Spencer carbines, Henry rifles, and Winchester rifles, capable of firing several rounds in succession without loading each cartridge directly into the chamber. Meanwhile, most of Custer's soldiers carried the Springfield Model 1873. It was a powerful and accurate carbine with good range. But after every shot, the soldier had to open the breech, remove the empty case, insert a new cartridge, and close the weapon again. One round against many rounds. Power against speed. But this is where the story is often oversimplified. Custer did not lose simply because some of his opponents had faster-firing guns. He also did not lose because the Springfield was a useless weapon, because in the hands of a stable formation, with distance and clear visibility, it could still inflict devastating wounds. The problem was that Custer's men could not maintain a stable formation. They were divided into separate groups spread across the hillsides and lost the ability to support one another. Native warriors used ravines and low ground hidden from the soldiers above to move steadily closer. By then, the more powerful gun was not necessarily the more dangerous gun. But before reaching Little Bighorn, we must return to the place where the Custer legend truly began. 13 years before his final battle, he commanded soldiers equipped with one of the most advanced repeating firearms in America. They could fire 7 rounds in succession, producing the kind of firepower that forced enemy cavalry to pay a heavy price. That place was Gettysburg in 1863. And the first truth that must be made clear is that not every soldier in Custer's brigade carried a Spencer rifle, despite what many people still believe. Gettysburg, when repeating firearms helped create the Custer legend. On the afternoon of July 3, 1863, the ground east of Gettysburg began to tremble. It was not because of artillery. It was the sound of thousands of horses' hooves pounding across the dry fields of Pennsylvania. Dust rolled in low clouds. Shouts were swallowed by gunfire. Lines of Confederate cavalry under J.E.B. Stuart were advancing just as Confederate infantry on the other side of the battlefield prepared to launch a massive assault against the center of the Union line. If Stuart broke through the Eastern cavalry screen, the Union rear could be threatened at the worst possible moment. And the man sent to stop him was only 23 years old. George Armstrong Custer had been promoted to brigadier general just 4 days earlier. He had barely had time to understand the men he now commanded. The Michigan Cavalry Brigade consisted of the 1st, 5th, 6th, and 7th Michigan regiments. Most of the soldiers knew the young general only by his unusual uniform, his bright red necktie, and his blonde hair, which made him recognizable from a great distance. Some believed Custer dressed that way because he enjoyed showing off. But place yourself on a battlefield filled with gunsmoke. When commands were torn apart by explosions, when formations disappeared behind dust and panicked horses, the soldiers could still see the brightly dressed man riding at the front. And Custer understood the power of that image. He did not merely want to command. He wanted his soldiers to see that he was sharing the same danger with them. But the young general was not the only thing that made the Michigan Brigade remarkable that day. Some of his soldiers carried a weapon that was changing the way cavalry fought, the 7-shot Spencer. This is also where one of the most common misconceptions begins. Many modern accounts give viewers the impression that all of Custer's men at Gettysburg were armed with Spencers. The reality was not that simple. The Michigan Brigade was not a uniform force. Spencers were concentrated mainly in the 5th Michigan Cavalry and part of the 6th Michigan Cavalry. The others still carried a variety of carbines along with revolvers and sabers. That meant Custer's firepower did not come from a complete army of repeating rifles. It came from coordination between units capable of rapid fire and units still fighting with more traditional weapons. So what made the Spencer special? Imagine a cavalryman who has dismounted, knelt behind a wooden fence, and seen the enemy charging toward him. With a single-shot carbine, after every shot, he had to retrieve a cartridge, open the breech, insert the new round, close it, and only then could he fire again. During that time, the distance between the two sides continued to shrink. The Spencer gave him 7 cartridges, already loaded inside a magazine tube in the stock. After each shot, the soldier operated the lever to eject the empty case and feed a new cartridge into the chamber. He still had to cock the hammer manually, But he did not have to stop and retrieve a new cartridge after every pull of the trigger. On paper, that only eliminated a few movements. On the battlefield, it could mean 3, 4, or 5 additional shots before the enemy cavalry reached him. Now imagine what that felt like from the other side. You have just endured a volley. You wait for the familiar pause while the enemy reloads. But the next volley comes almost immediately. Then another follows. One Spencer could not stop an entire cavalry formation, but hundreds, firing repeatedly, could bring down horses, throw ranks off course, and break confidence before the two sides collided. Even so, the Spencer was not a perfect weapon. It produced enormous amounts of black powder smoke. After only a few volleys, a soldier might see the enemy through a thick gray haze. The 7 rounds in the stock did not last forever. When the magazine was empty, the user had to reload it. If the enemy had already come too close, the advantage of the repeating firearm quickly disappeared. At that point, the battle returned to more primitive things. Revolvers, sabers, the weight of the horse, and the nerve of the man in the saddle. At East Cavalry Field, the distance between the two forces did not remain wide enough for the fight to be decided by gunfire alone. The Confederate cavalry continued advancing. Custer realized that if he simply stood still and waited, the weight of the enemy formation could crush the defensive line. He chose the response that would become most familiar to him. Attack first. Custer appeared before the 1st Michigan Cavalry. Ahead of them were dust-flashing steel and a mass of cavalry charging directly toward them. The soldiers could hear the enemy's hoofbeats growing louder. They knew that within seconds, the two masses of men and horses would crash into each other. Custer turned and shouted, "Come on, you Wolverines!" Then he drove his horse forward. No painting can truly recreate that moment. The two formations collided in the middle of the field inside a massive cloud of dust. Horses slammed into horses. Men were thrown from their saddles. Long carbines became awkward and difficult to use. Revolvers fired at distances of only a few yards. Sabers came down amid the clash of metal and the sound of men screaming. Custer was no longer a general watching the battle from a distance. He was inside the mass of men crashing into Stuart's formation. But this is where we must be especially careful. We know that he led the charge. We know that he was present in close combat. But there is no reliable evidence identifying the exact firearm in Custer's hands. He may have carried an officer's revolver. He may have used a saber. A carbine may have been attached to his saddle or carried by an orderly. But the fact that the 5th Michigan Cavalry used Spencers does not prove that Custer carried one himself. This is a boundary that movies often erase. People see a commander, a famous weapon, and a major victory. Then all three are combined into one complete image, Custer holding a Spencer and leading an army of repeating rifles to defeat Stuart. Real history is not that tidy. The strength of the Michigan Brigade came from several layers. Some units used Spencers to maintain rapid fire. Other units protected the flanks, maneuvered, and prepared to charge. Nearby Union forces also helped stop Stuart. Commanders coordinated with one another. The defensive line remained connected and capable of mutual support. Custer was a prominent part of that victory, but he did not win alone. Neither did the Spencer. So what truly caused Stuart's attack to fail? It was not one special shot. It was timing. It was gunfire slowing and disrupting the enemy formation before the collision. It was the decision to launch a counterattack at the exact moment the Confederate ranks were advancing. It was the ability of different units to hold the same battle line together. And finally, it was Custer's willingness to gamble his own life to make his soldiers move forward. Gettysburg turned him into a hero. But that victory also planted a dangerous belief inside Custer. He had watched a larger formation charge toward him and had refused to retreat. He had used speed to cut through the strength of his opponent. He had ridden directly into the most dangerous point and survived. Think about what a victory like that could do to a 23-year-old man. It could make him believe that his instincts were always right. That boldness could compensate for every weakness. That if the commander moved forward fast enough, his soldiers would follow, and the enemy would be the first to hesitate. At Gettysburg, that belief was rewarded. 13 years later at Little Bighorn, it would be tested under completely different conditions. In Pennsylvania, Custer had supporting units on both sides. He had a broad battle line that had not been severed. He knew friendly forces remained behind him and on his flanks. At Little Bighorn, he would divide his regiment, move beyond the sight of the other detachments, and face a force far larger than he expected. That is why Gettysburg matters more than the story of a 7-shot firearm. It shows that a weapon only has value when a commander places it in the right conditions. The Spencer was effective because the soldiers had positions comrades and enough time to turn rapid fire into pressure. Firepower does not exist independently. It needs formation. It needs visibility. It needs supply and support. Most importantly, it needs a commander who understands when to advance and when not to cut himself off from the rest of the battlefield. Custer left Gettysburg with the reputation of a man willing to ride into the most dangerous place. But from that day forward, he also began to be pursued by his own legend. Every victory made recklessness look a little more like genius. Every survival gave him another reason to believe in his luck. 5 years later, that belief carried the 7th Cavalry Regiment to a Cheyenne village beside the Washita River. The cold was so severe that breath froze white against the horses' whiskers. Soldiers moved through the snow before dawn carrying Spencer's revolvers and sabers. But this time, they were not facing a cavalry formation clearly visible across an open field. They were approaching a sleeping village, and when the first shot rang out, Custer's victory would no longer possess the same unmistakable glory it had carried at Gettysburg. Washita 3 layers of weapons in a pre-dawn attack. 5 years after Gettysburg, Custer once again prepared to charge into a position before the enemy had time to organize a defense. But this time he was not facing lines of cavalry clearly visible across the fields of Pennsylvania. He was facing a Cheyenne village sleeping beneath the snow. Before dawn, on November 27, 1868, bitter cold covered the banks of the Washita River in white. The horses breathed out thin clouds of vapor. Snow clung to the boots, coats, and carbines that the soldiers of the 7th Cavalry Regiment held close to their bodies. Below them, in the valley, stood the teepees of Black Kettle's village. Most of the fires had nearly gone out. Women and children were still sleeping inside. Some warriors had only recently returned after days of travel. No one in the village knew that Custer's troops had come close enough to hear dogs barking and see figures moving among the lodges. Pause at that moment. Hundreds of people were asleep. Around them, cavalry detachments had already been divided and were silently moving into position. Custer did not intend to call the enemy out to fight on open ground. He wanted to seal off the village from several directions and strike before the people inside understood what was happening. It was a very different kind of attack from Gettysburg. At Gettysburg, he reacted to a threat advancing toward him. At Washita, he created the first shock. Just before daylight, a military band was ordered to play Gary Owen, the tune that had become the familiar signature of the 7th Cavalry Regiment. But the cold made the instruments difficult to play. The music sounded briefly distorted and broken before it was swallowed by hoofbeats and gunfire. The cavalry detachments descended at the same time. Within seconds, the quiet valley became a place of smoke screams and horses running in every direction. To understand how Custer's men created such intense pressure during the opening attack, we need to examine the 3 types of weapons carried by the soldiers of the 7th Cavalry. It was not one gun. It was a system of carbines, revolvers, and sabers. Each became truly dangerous at a different distance. Spencer 7 shots before the enemy could get to his feet. The primary weapon carried by Custer's soldiers at Washita was the Spencer Model 1865 carbine. It was shorter than an infantry rifle, easier to use on horseback, and held 7 cartridges inside a magazine tube in the stock. During a pre-dawn attack, those 7 rounds had special value. A soldier charging into the valley did not have to stop after every shot to retrieve a new cartridge from his pouch. He could operate the lever, eject the empty case, feed the next round into the chamber, cock the hammer, and fire again. The first shot awakened the village. The second was aimed at people running from their lodges. The third might be fired at a warrior searching for his horse or trying to reach a weapon. Before the magazine was empty, a soldier could fire all 7 rounds in a very short time. Now place yourself on the other side. You have just been awakened by gunfire. Smoke pours through the lodge entrance. Horses are pulling against their lines, children are crying, and adults are running to find weapons. You do not yet know where the attack is coming from, but bullets are already arriving from several directions. Under those conditions, the Spencer's power did not come only from speed. It came from denying the enemy enough time to understand the battlefield. Custer's attack was built around that confusion. If the Cheyenne warriors gathered, found their horses, and formed a defensive line, the 7th Cavalry's advantage of surprise would quickly disappear. The opening fire therefore had to be fast enough to keep the entire village in disorder. The Spencer accomplished that. But it also had limitations. Once the 7 rounds were gone, the soldier had to reload the magazine tube. Wearing heavy gloves in freezing weather and while a horse was moving, the task was not nearly as fast as it was on the training ground. Black powder smoke also thickened after every volley. Before long, someone at one end of the village might no longer be able to see what was happening at the other. And when the distance narrowed to only a few steps, the carbine became too long, too slow, and too awkward. That was when the second layer of weapons was drawn. Revolver, 6 shots, when there was no room left to escape. Soldiers of the 7th Cavalry at Washita may have carried the Colt Model 1860 Army or the Remington Model 1858, both common .44 caliber revolvers from the Civil War era. Each had 6 chambers. At close range, they were terrifying weapons. A soldier could hold the reins in one hand, draw his revolver with the other, and fire at a target only a few yards away. In the spaces between the lodges, where people and horses constantly crossed the line of sight, a handgun was far easier to maneuver than a carbine. But do not imagine these revolvers as later pistols using metallic cartridges. Each chamber had to be loaded separately with powder, a bullet, and a percussion cap. This preparation was usually completed before the battle. Once all 6 shots had been fired, reloading in the middle of the chaos was almost a hopeless task. The revolver was therefore not an endless source of firepower. It was 6 final chances. 6 shots for the moment when the enemy had come too close for the carbine. 6 shots before the soldier had to switch to something else, find cover, or face the person directly in front of him. Imagine a soldier who had emptied his Spencer. He let the carbine fall against its sling, drew his revolver, and continued moving between the lodges. Smoke burned his eyes. Horses ran past him. No one could clearly hear the commands anymore. Under those conditions, the difference between a military operation planned on a map and a real battle became painfully clear. Maps contained neat arrows. The battlefield contained only people running, people falling, and decisions made in seconds. Saber when the gun was no longer fast enough. The third layer of weapons was the cavalry saber. To many people today, the saber seems like an ancient relic, almost ceremonial. But in 1868, it was still part of the combat equipment of the United States Cavalry. During a charge, a saber did not need to be reloaded. It could not suffer a stuck cartridge case. It did not run out of powder after 6 or 7 shots. When a horse was charging, and the distance had narrowed to the length of an arm, a sword stroke could arrive before the enemy had time to raise a gun. But that advantage also reveals how close the fighting at Washita had become. The carbine was for distance. The revolver was for the final few yards. The saber was for the moment when distance nearly disappeared. Those 3 layers of weapons allowed Custer's men to continue fighting as the battle shifted from an attack by gunfire into chaotic collisions among the lodges. But weapons could not make the battlefield clear. The farther the soldiers moved into the village, the harder it became to distinguish who was resisting, who was fleeing, and who was only trying to move children out of the line of fire. That is why Washita has remained controversial for more than a century. Custer described it as a victory over a hostile village. Critics called it an attack on a community that included women and children. The painful truth is that both images existed during the same morning. There were Cheyenne warriors who took up guns and fought back. There were also people who never had time to reach a weapon. American soldiers fell during the fighting. Women and children were also killed in the attack. If we look at Washita only through a list of firearms, we miss the most important truth. Of all, weapons do not decide whom they are used against. People do. What gun did Custer carry? This is a question many people want answered clearly, but the surviving evidence does not give us that certainty. Custer almost certainly carried the equipment expected of a cavalry officer, a revolver and a saber. He may also have had a carbine or a long gun carried by an orderly. However, there is not enough evidence to identify the exact model of revolver he used that morning at Washita. It may have been a Colt. It may also have been a Remington. But without a letter naming it a confirmed artifact, or a sufficiently reliable eyewitness account choosing a specific model, simply because it looks appropriate for Custer is how legends are created. There is one gun we can exclude from this battle. Custer's famous pair of pearl-gripped Smith & Wesson No. 2 revolvers could not have been present at Washita. The reason is simple. He did not receive the pair until October 1869, nearly a year after the battle. That detail may seem small, but it reveals a common mistake in the way historical weapons are described. People see a gun that once belonged to Custer. Then they place it in any battle connected to his name. The date is ignored, the origin is ignored. After the claim is repeated several times, a guess begins to be presented as fact. So when you see a painting of Custer at Washita carrying white grip revolvers or decorated Smith & Wessons, you already know what question to ask. Did he own them at that time? Sometimes, that question matters more than the name of the gun. A victory that did not end when the gunfire stopped. By the end of the battle, Black Kettle's village had been destroyed. Food and property were burned. Some Cheyenne were taken prisoner. Custer's troops killed a large number of horses to prevent them from returning to the warriors. Smoke from the fires rose through the snow-covered valley. To Custer, it was proof that the campaign had achieved its objective. But other native communities lay beyond the village that had been attacked. Warriors from nearby areas began gathering and moving toward the sound of the gunfire. A small detachment, led by Major Joel Elliott, became separated from the main force during the pursuit. Elliott and the men with him did not return. They were surrounded and killed a short distance from the village. Custer knew they were missing, but he did not immediately turn back to search for them. He withdrew most of the regiment and the prisoners before a larger native force could block the route. That decision saved the rest of the 7th Cavalry from the danger of being surrounded. But it also left a deep fracture among the officers. Some never forgot that Elliott and his men had been left behind. Keep that detail in mind. At Washita, Custer divided his force, one detachment disappeared from view, and the commander had to choose between turning back to search for them or protecting the remainder of the formation. 8 years later, at Little Bighorn, Custer himself would move beyond the sight of the other detachments. And that time, no one arrived in time to bring him back. Washita strengthened Custer's reputation as a commander who could strike quickly, create surprise, and withdraw before the enemy fully assembled. But it also revealed the limits of that method. A divided attack succeeded only while every detachment remained under control. A Spencer was useful only while the soldiers still had ammunition and knew where the enemy was. A revolver provided only 6 shots before the hand holding it was left empty. And no commander, no matter how bold, could see everything happening beyond his line of sight. After Washita, Custer became more than a controversial name, he also began building a private collection of weapons. The guns that followed were not issued from military stores. They arrived in velvet-lined cases with pearl grips, custom-made barrels, and sometimes his name engraved upon them as gifts for a celebrity. But remember what Washita has just shown us. A gun that belonged to Custer did not necessarily follow him onto a battlefield. And sometimes, the most beautiful weapon in the gun cabinet was the one that had never been fired at another human being. Custer's gun cabinet gifts more beautiful than the truth. After Washita, George Armstrong Custer's name no longer appeared only in military reports. It appeared in newspapers and stories about the American West, and in the imagination of a nation captivated by the image of a blonde-haired officer riding through the wilderness. Custer became a celebrity. And celebrities often receive gifts. Some gifts arrived in wooden cases lined with velvet. Some firearms were engraved with his name, decorated with polished metal, or fitted with pearl grips. Others came from friends gun manufacturers or people who wanted their names connected to the officer who had captured the nation's attention. Over time, a collection of weapons appeared in Custer's home that would have made any 19th century firearms enthusiast stop and stare. Revolvers, hunting rifles, target rifles, carbines from the Civil War era, sabers, hunting knives, and firearms designed for purposes entirely different from warfare. But this is where history begins to become dangerous. A gun that once sat inside Custer's cabinet can easily be transformed into the gun he carried at Gettysburg. A gift presented after Washita can appear in a painting of Washita. A target rifle that never left his home can be placed in his hands during the final minutes at Little Bighorn. When the image is beautiful enough, the story is compelling enough, and the mistake is repeated often enough, speculation gradually begins to look like truth. So from this point forward, we must establish one very simple rule. Do not begin by asking whether a gun once belonged to Custer. Ask when he received it. Ask what it was designed to do. And most importantly, ask whether any evidence shows that it actually followed him onto the battlefield. The pearl-gripped revolvers. Among the most beautiful weapons ever owned by Custer was a pair of Smith & Wesson No. 2 Army revolvers, chambered in .32 rimfire. The two guns rested inside an elegant case with a soft lining. Their metalwork was finely decorated. Their grips were made from pale mother-of-pearl that reflected light differently from every angle. They did not resemble the rough military revolvers usually carried in cavalry holsters. They looked like gifts intended for a celebrity. In October 1869, J.B. Sutherland presented the pair to Custer. That date is extremely important. It proves that the Smith & Wessons could not have appeared at Washita because the attack on Black Kettle's village had taken place nearly a year earlier. But try searching for illustrations of Custer. It is not difficult to find him holding one or two white-gripped revolvers, regardless of the year in which the scene is supposed to take place. Why? Because pearl grips seem perfectly suited to the image of an officer who liked to stand out. They were bright, elegant, and unusual, just like his red necktie and elaborate uniform. The image is so convincing that viewers rarely stop to ask whether Custer even owned the guns at the time being portrayed. But history cannot be determined by whether an object appears to suit its owner. The pair of Smith & Wessons unquestionably belonged to Custer. We have the surviving artifacts, the records, and the date on which they were presented. But there is no reliable evidence that he ever used them in battle. The .32 rimfire cartridge was relatively small compared with the .44 caliber military revolvers that Custer and other cavalry officers were accustomed to using. They may have been convenient to carry, but they were not an obvious choice for a violent engagement on the plains. Perhaps Custer fired them for practice. Perhaps he carried them on a particular journey. It is also possible that they spent most of their time inside the case brought out for visitors as symbols of his fame. The surviving evidence does not allow us to go any further. And sometimes, the most honest answer about a famous firearm is simply this. We know he owned it. We do not know whether he ever fought with it. The Sharps from another era. The collection associated with Custer also included a .44 caliber Sharps Model 1853. The name Sharps alone evokes an entire world of marksmen, hunters, and battles fought before metallic cartridges became standard. The Model 1853 belonged to an early generation of breech-loading firearms. It was created before Custer became the young general at Gettysburg, before Washita, and before the 7th Cavalry pushed deep into the West. A Sharps like this could have held several meanings for its owner. It may have been a hunting rifle. It may have been a collector's piece. It may have recalled the Civil War era or been preserved for its technical value. But the fact that a museum identifies the gun as having belonged to Custer does not tell us how far it traveled with him. No reliable document places it in Custer's hands at Gettysburg. There is no evidence that he carried it at Washita. And no archaeological artifact connects this Sharps to Little Bighorn. That does not make the gun any less interesting. On the contrary, It shows that Custer's interest in firearms went far beyond the minimum requirements of a military officer. He did not use guns only because duty required it. He liked them. He hunted, tested, compared, and paid attention to accuracy at different distances. He lived during a period when firearms technology was changing rapidly, when within a single decade, a soldier could move from percussion revolvers to metallic cartridge handguns, and from single-shot carbines to repeating firearms holding 7, 15, or 17 rounds. Custer lived through all of those changes. His gun cabinet, therefore, resembled a miniature museum of the 19th century. But a museum is not a battlefield, and that is a boundary we must never forget. The Creedmoor that was too beautiful for the final battle. Another firearm once owned by Custer almost seems designed to create confusion. It was a .44 caliber Remington Ryder long-range Creedmoor target rifle. A long barrel, a slender frame, sights designed for precision at extended range. This was not the kind of weapon people usually imagine in a chaotic, close-range battle filled with dust horses and continuous gunfire. It was a target rifle, a tool for patience, a stable shooting position, and carefully calculated shots. The Creedmoor was reportedly a gift from Libby Custer, the wife who later devoted much of her life to protecting her husband's image. You can imagine Custer raising the rifle, feeling the weight of its long barrel, looking through its sights, and testing its capabilities on a target range or during a competition. It suited another side of his personality. Not the commander shouting in the middle of a charge, but the man who wanted to prove that he could shoot farther, shoot more accurately, and master the newest technology. That is why when people see the Creedmoor displayed in a museum, it is easy for them to imagine it strapped to a saddle during the final campaign of 1876. But in this case, the evidence is very clear. Custer did not carry the Creedmoor during the campaign that ended at Little Bighorn. It did not disappear with him. It was not taken from the battlefield by a warrior. And it could not have been the long rifle shown in paintings of The Last Stand. This is one of the rare cases in which we can draw a firm line. Custer owned it. Custer may have used it for target shooting, but it was not present in the final battle. Remember the Creedmoor, because it is the perfect example of how a genuine artifact can create a false story. No one has to lie deliberately. A museum only needs to place Custer's name beneath the rifle. An artist sees its impressive shape. An article places a photograph of the gun beside a story about Little Bighorn. Then the viewer connects the pieces, and from that moment forward, a rifle that was never present on the battlefield begins to live in public memory as though it disappeared with its owner. The two nameless British revolvers. If the Smith & Wessons and the Creedmoor are firearms with clear surviving artifacts but uncertain combat histories, the pair of British revolvers represents the exact opposite. Accounts suggest that Custer carried them during his final campaign. But we do not know exactly what they were. Many years after Little Bighorn Lieutenant Edward Godfrey described Custer as carrying two British-made revolvers. According to his memory, they had a self-cocking mechanism, meaning that the shooter could pull the trigger and cause a cylinder to rotate and the hammer to cock in a single movement. The grips were light in color, often described as white. A lanyard ring was fitted beneath the grip. Godfrey called them bulldogs. That single word has led researchers through decades of debate. Was he referring to the Webley British Bulldog? Was it a Webley RIC? Or was it another British or Belgian revolver with a similar appearance? The problem lies in the timing and in the way people used names. The famous British Bulldog model, known to many people today, is generally associated with a period after 1876. That makes identifying Custer's pair much more difficult. Some researchers favor the Webley RIC, a revolver that definitely existed before Little Bighorn. Others have suggested the Galland and Somerville, or another .442 caliber double-action variant. But no candidate fully explains every detail in the description. The shape may be correct, but the grips are wrong. The caliber may be plausible, but the lanyard ring does not match. The name sounds familiar, but the date creates doubt. Most importantly, Godfrey was remembering the revolvers many years after Custer's death. Human memory is not a photograph. It may preserve the color of a grip, but forget the type of action. It may remember that the guns were British, but use a popular name that appeared later. It may combine something once seen directly with things read or heard over the following decades. That does not mean Godfrey was lying. It only means that his account must be used with the proper level of caution. We can say that Custer probably carried a pair of British double-action revolvers with light-colored grips, but we cannot state with certainty that they were Webley British Bulldogs. Be cautious when a video places a specific Webley revolver on the screen and declares, "This was Custer's final gun." No one can prove that. The actual two guns, if they were indeed the revolvers Godfrey remembered, disappeared after Little Bighorn. No serial numbers, no confirmed firing pin impressions, no recovery records, no surviving artifacts to examine under a microscope. All that remains is a shadow in the memory of a survivor who had been positioned on another part of the battlefield. One man, many versions. Looking inside Custer's gun cabinet reveals several different versions of the man. The pro-gripped Smith & Wessons belonged to the Custer of fame, the celebrity who received gifts beautiful enough to display. The Sharps belonged to the Custer of the past, the man who lived during an age when old and new firearms existed side by side. The Creedmoor belonged to the competitive Custer the man, who wanted to shoot farther, shoot more accurately, and demonstrate his personal skill. The British revolvers belonged to the Custer of legend, the man we think we see in the final battle, even though the physical evidence disappeared. But among all of those guns, one question remains unanswered. Which ones truly traveled with him across the plains, the hills, and the encounters with the Lakota? Which ones remained inside velvet-lined cases? Which ones were carried as symbols of status? And which ones were actually fired when Custer's life was in danger? To answer that, we must leave the museum display cases behind. We must turn to Custer's private letters. Not accounts written after his death, not paintings, not the memories of other people, but the words he wrote while he was still alive, during a campaign along the Yellowstone River in 1873. There, Custer described a new Springfield rifle. He recorded shooting distances. He described the antelope he had killed. He compared his weapon with the Winchesters carried by other officers, and for the first time, we no longer have to guess what he held. But the story goes beyond a hunting trip. Only a few weeks later, a soldier named Tuttle carried the sporting Springfield into a position along the riverbank and used it to fire at Lakota warriors. This time, one of Custer's personal firearms truly crossed from the world of hunting into the battlefield. And the man who pulled the trigger was not Custer. Yellowstone, 1873. When Custer left behind his own evidence. The guns inside museum display cases can tell us what Custer once owned, but they cannot tell us where he carried them. To move closer to the truth, we must leave the museum, move beyond the paintings of the Last Stand, and travel to a place far less famous than Little Bighorn. The summer of 1873, along the Yellowstone River. There, among sun-scorched grasslands, herds of antelope and sudden clashes with the Lakota, Custer wrote about his own firearms, not through the account of someone remembering events decades later, not through an object connected to his name after his death, but through letters written while the gun was still in his possession. For the first time, we can hear Custer speak as a man who genuinely loved firearms. He recorded distances. He remembered individual shots. He compared power and accuracy. He did not write like a general preparing a victory report. He wrote like a hunter who had just discovered a gun that excited him. A campaign that followed the railroad. In 1873, Custer and the 7th Cavalry Regiment were assigned to protect the Northern Pacific Railroad survey expedition. The proposed railroad would cross lands that the Lakota still use for hunting and travel. On the maps of investors, it was a line leading westward. On the ground, it crossed water sources, hunting grounds, and territories the Lakota had never considered surrendered to white settlers. The survey expedition, therefore, carried more than engineers' measuring equipment and supply wagons. It had soldiers. It had scouts. It had artillery. It had thousands of rounds of ammunition. The column stretched across the grasslands like a moving town. Wagon wheels crushed the dry earth. Livestock stirred clouds of dust. Soldiers rode along the outer edges of the formation, constantly watching the distant ridgelines. Sometimes nothing happened for an entire day. There was only sunlight, wind, and the creaking of wood beneath the weight of the wagons. Then several figures would appear on the horizon. No one knew whether they were a small scouting party hunters or a sign that a larger force was watching them. In that setting, Custer was not merely a commander. He was also a hunter, and the Yellowstone grasslands gave him countless opportunities to test the guns he loved. My New Springfield. In a letter to Libby in June 1873, Custer mentioned "my new Springfield." That single phrase is worth more than dozens of paintings depicting him. It confirms that this was not simply a gun taken from military stores. Custer regarded it as his personal weapon. He described using the Springfield to shoot antelope on the grasslands. He remembered one running target at a distance of approximately 200 yards. Another was killed at a measured distance of nearly 280 yards. To Custer, those numbers were not minor details. They were evidence of the gun's capabilities. He wanted Libby to know how far he had fired. He wanted to record the weapon's accuracy. Perhaps he also wanted the reader to picture him standing on the prairie, raising the rifle, holding steadily on the target, and bringing down a running animal at a distance where many people would have struggled even to see it clearly. You can feel the pride in the way he described it. This was no longer the Custer of military reports, where the dead were reduced to numbers and battles became arrows on a map. This was Custer in private life, a man who enjoyed the moment before pulling the trigger, who enjoyed feeling the recoil travel through his shoulder, who enjoyed walking to the fallen animal and looking back across the distance of the shot. He also compared the Springfield with the Winchesters used by his brother Tom Custer and several other officers. According to Custer, the Winchester proved highly accurate at close range, around 100 yards. But at greater distances, he rated his Springfield more highly. It was not a scientific test. There was no standardized shooting bench. There were no controlled wind conditions. There were no repeated shot groups for measuring accuracy. There was only Custer's experience during a hunting trip. But the comparison revealed what he valued in a firearm. Custer valued power. He valued range. He valued the ability to place one accurate bullet on a distant target. He was not attracted only to rapid fire. This matters because Little Bighorn is often portrayed as a simple confrontation between the slow-firing Springfield and the rapid-firing Winchester. But Custer had experience with both types and understood the trade-offs between them. The Winchester allowed repeated shots. The Springfield gave him greater confidence at longer distances. The question was not which gun was always better. The question was the distance at which the battle was fought. The soldier who carried Custer's gun. Custer's personal Springfield was not always carried on his own shoulder. A soldier named Tuttle often carried it. That may seem strange to a modern viewer. If Custer valued the gun so highly, why did he not always carry it himself? A commanding officer on campaign had many other responsibilities. He needed to observe the formation. He needed to read the terrain. He needed to receive and send messages. He needed to move quickly between units. A long rifle could become cumbersome when the commander constantly needed to use binoculars, consult maps, or signal to subordinates. An orderly might therefore carry hunting rifles, ammunition, and personal equipment for an officer. When Custer wanted to hunt, the Springfield was brought to him. When he did not need it, Tuttle carried it. That small detail opens a much larger question. If a gun belonged to Custer but was carried and fired by someone else, what should we call it? Calling it Custer's gun is correct in terms of ownership, but calling it the gun Custer used in battle is an entirely different claim. Only a few weeks later, that distinction became painfully real along the Yellowstone River. When a hunting rifle entered the battlefield, on August 11, 1873, tensions along the Yellowstone River erupted into combat. This was not a massive cavalry charge like Gettysburg, nor was it a pre-dawn attack on a village like Washita. The two sides were separated by the river, the terrain, and naturally protected positions. Lakota warriors appeared on the opposite bank, fired at the troops, and attempted to pressure the moving expedition. Gunfire echoed across the water. Bullets struck earth, wood, and stone. Soldiers sought cover behind steep banks, supply wagons, or anything strong enough to protect part of their bodies. During that clash, Tuttle carried a sporting Springfield. He found a protected position along the riverbank. From there, Tuttle began firing at the warriors on the opposite side. This was the moment when the hunting rifle stopped being used to bring down antelope. The targets ahead knew how to find cover, they knew how to return fire. And they understood that if the soldier exposed his head for too long, one bullet could end everything. Tuttle was described as a skilled marksman. He used the Springfield's long-range capability, fired from a protected position, and inflicted casualties on the opposing side. Imagine the scene. Tuttle lay or crouched low behind the riverbank. He raised the rifle and searched for a figure among the dust and grass across the water. One shot rang out. White smoke burst from the barrel. He lowered the rifle, opened the action, loaded another round, and searched again. Every time he raised his head, he accepted that someone on the opposite bank was also aiming at him. The Springfield gave Tuttle distance, but distance did not provide complete safety. Eventually, a bullet struck him in the head. Everything ended at the same position from which he had been firing only seconds earlier. The soldier who carried Custer's gun died beside the weapon belonging to his commanding officer. That detail creates a chilling paradox. We have evidence that a personal firearm connected to Custer was taken into combat. We know who held it. We know its approximate position. We know it was used to fire at the enemy. But the man who pulled the trigger was not Custer. This is why the study of historical firearms demands a level of precision that can sometimes feel frustrating. Remove Tuttle's name, and the story immediately becomes this. Custer used his Springfield during the Yellowstone battle. It sounds entirely reasonable. The gun belonged to him. He was present during the campaign. The weapon was used in combat. But those three facts do not automatically create a fourth fact. There is no conclusive evidence that Custer personally fired the Springfield at Lakota warriors during that engagement. The accurate statement must be this. Custer's sporting Springfield was carried during the campaign, used by him for hunting, and used by Tuttle in combat. It sounds less dramatic, but it is more accurate. Sometimes the most truthful history is found in statements that do not completely satisfy our imagination. Another gun appears. The story would be far simpler if the Springfield had been Custer's only long gun during that summer. But it was not. In October 1873, after the Yellowstone campaign, Custer wrote to E. Remington and Sons. In the letter, he praised a Remington Rolling Block sporting rifle that had been made for him. The rifle was chambered in 50 to 70. It fired a large, powerful cartridge, suitable for hunting big game in the American West. The rolling block action was extremely simple. The shooter pulled back the hammer, rotated the breech block to open the chamber, inserted one cartridge, closed the action, and fired. There was no magazine tube. There were no 7 rounds waiting inside the stock. There was no rapid string of fire like a Winchester. There was only one round. But the breech block was strong, the mechanism was durable, and the cartridge had enough power to bring down large animals at considerable distances. Custer was highly pleased with the rifle. He described his hunting success as difficult shots, and the Remington's performance under real conditions. It is easy to understand why the rolling block appealed to him. It matched the way Custer wanted to see himself. Not as the man who fired the most shots, but as the man who could settle the matter with one well-placed round. A single-shot rifle forced the user to trust the first shot. If it missed, the shooter had to open the action, reload, and find the target again. During a hunt, the animal might already have escaped. During combat, the person ahead might already have returned fire. The Springfield and the Remington were not the same gun. This is where many stories about Custer's firearms begin to blur together. During the same year, 1873, he mentioned a personal Springfield. Later, he praised a Remington Rolling Block chambered in 50 to 70. Both were long guns. Both were used in the American West. Both were suitable for hunting and long-range shooting. And storytellers might refer to either of them simply as a sporting rifle. Without paying attention to the manufacturer or the action, the two guns can easily be merged into one. But they were not the same weapon. The Springfield used a different type of breech action. The Remington used its distinctive rolling block mechanism. They had separate histories, designs, and bodies of evidence. Whenever a source claims that Custer used his famous hunting rifle without identifying the model, we must stop. Was it the Springfield mentioned in the June letter, or was it the Remington he praised in October? Was the writer relying on a contemporary document, or simply repeating a story that had been simplified over generations? One incorrect name can change the entire historical image. If we place the Springfield in Tuttle's hands, we are telling the story of an officer's personal rifle being used in combat by a soldier. If we place the Remington in Custer's hands at Little Bighorn, we enter an area supported by much weaker evidence. And if we merge the two guns into one, we create a weapon that never existed. Custer understood the trade-offs. The Yellowstone letters show that Custer was not blindly impressed by firearms technology. He was not a man who believed that faster shooting was always better. He recognized the Winchester's advantage at close range. He valued the Springfield and Remington for their accuracy and power at longer distances. He understood that a repeating firearm could produce more shots. But he also understood that a more powerful rifle could accomplish things that a lighter bullet could not easily achieve. Why does that matter? Because 3 years later, the soldiers under Custer would fight with single-shot Springfield Model 1873 carbines, while some Lakota and Cheyenne warriors carried repeating Henry or Winchester rifles. It is often claimed that Custer failed to understand the danger of repeating firearms. The letters from 1873 make that conclusion far too simple. He had seen Winchesters in action. His relatives and fellow officers used them. He had personally compared the Winchester's performance with his own rifle. Custer knew that rapid fire had value, but he also believed that range power and accuracy could matter more under many circumstances. The problem was not that he had never seen a repeating firearm. The problem was that, at Little Bighorn, the battle did not take place at a distance Custer could choose. From letters to legend. Yellowstone in 1873 gives us a rare level of evidence. Custer personally confirmed that he owned and used a Springfield for hunting. Campaign accounts placed a sporting Springfield in Tuttle's hands during combat. The letter to Remington confirms that Custer owned and highly valued a rolling block chambered in 50-70. But even these sources have limits. We do not know for certain whether Custer used the rolling block to fire at another person during the Yellowstone campaign. Without a serial number or an unbroken chain of documentation, we cannot prove in every detail that Tuttle's Springfield was the same physical gun Custer described. And we still do not know which of those firearms later accompanied him during the campaign of 1876. Those uncertainties do not weaken the story. They make it more truthful. History is not a room in which every object carries a label. It resembles a battlefield after the smoke has cleared. There are footprints, there are cartridge cases, there are objects left behind, and there are gaps that force us to recognize when we must stop. A change was coming to the 7th Cavalry. When Custer returned from Yellowstone, he still served in a regiment carrying the remains of the Civil War era. Many soldiers continued to use aging Spencer and Sharps carbines. Those firearms had endured years of service, repeated repairs, and countless marches across the plains. But the United States Army was preparing to change its entire weapon system. In 1874, the 7th Cavalry Regiment began receiving the new Springfield Model 1873 Trapdoor Carbine. To a modern viewer, the choice can seem confusing. The Army was replacing Spencer repeating carbines with a weapon that held only one cartridge. Why would a military force call that modernization? Why would it abandon speed? And why would a man like Custer, who had witnessed the power of repeating firearms from Gettysburg to Yellowstone, still lead his soldiers into the final campaign carrying single-shot Springfields? The answer cannot be reduced to one simple mistake. It lies in range bullet power logistics and the Army's long-standing fear that soldiers armed with repeating firearms would exhaust their ammunition before the real battle even began. But a decision that appeared reasonable inside an ordnance department would create a deadly paradox on the hills of Little Bighorn. The new Springfield was designed to bring down targets at long range. Custer's opponents would not remain at long range long enough for him to exploit that advantage. 1874. Why did the Army replace a 7-shot gun with a single-shot gun? In the summer of 1874, the 7th Cavalry Regiment entered the Black Hills carrying a new weapon. From the outside, the Springfield Model 1873 Trapdoor Carbine appeared to be a clear step forward. It was more compact than an infantry rifle. It had a strong breech action. It fired a powerful cartridge. It offered good accuracy. Most importantly, it was the product of an Army system attempting to move beyond the chaotic collection of weapons left over from the Civil War. But one detail has kept this decision controversial to the present day. The older Spencer could hold 7 cartridges inside its stock. The new Springfield held only 1. The United States Army replaced a repeating firearm with a gun that required the soldier to open the breech, remove the empty case, insert a new cartridge, and close the action after every shot. If that sounds like a step backward, you are not alone. But to understand why the Army made this decision, we must view it through the eyes of a logistics officer in 1874, not through the experience of someone who already knows what happened at Little Bighorn. 1 regiment, too many types of guns. After the Civil War, the United States military arsenal contained an enormous mixture of weapons. Spencer, Sharps, Burnside, Maynard, Remington. These carbines had been manufactured in different years, used different ammunition, and required different replacement parts. A single regiment might carry several types of firearms at the same time. That may not sound serious until ammunition must be supplied across plains located hundreds of miles from the nearest military depot. A cartridge made for a Spencer could not be used in a Springfield. Sharp's ammunition was useless to a man carrying a revolver. If part of the breech mechanism broke, the armorer needed the correct component for that specific model. Inside a military post, that was an inconvenience. During a campaign, it could become a disaster. Imagine a mule train carrying thousands of cartridges across roads that barely existed. One crate was lost. One wagon overturned inside a ravine. One label was incorrect. When the ammunition finally reached the unit, a soldier might discover that the cartridges inside the crate did not fit the gun he carried. The Army wanted to end that confusion. It needed a standardized system. 1 primary type of ammunition. 1 firearm action that was easy to teach, easy to repair, and strong enough to endure dust, rain, freezing weather, and months on horseback. The Springfield Model 1873 was selected under those conditions. It was not because the Army had never heard of repeating firearms. It was because the Army wanted a weapon capable of serving tens of thousands of soldiers under a single logistical system. The small door on the breech. The name trapdoor came from the breech block, which opened upward like a small door. After firing, the soldier moved the hammer to the safety position, raised the locking lever, and lifted the hinged breech block on top of the weapon. The extractor pulled the empty cartridge case from the chamber. The soldier removed a new round from his cartridge pouch, inserted it, closed the breech block, and cocked the hammer. Only then was the weapon ready to fire again. On the training ground, those movements could be performed fairly quickly. The hands knew the routine, the cartridges were in the proper position. No one was returning fire. No horse was collapsing nearby. There was no smoke burning the soldier's eyes and no screaming that could make him forget which step he had just completed. But a battlefield was not a training ground. When an opponent was approaching, every movement consumed time. Open the breech, remove the case, find the cartridge, insert it into the chamber, close the action, cock the hammer, aim, fire. A well-trained soldier could repeat that sequence several times in 1 minute, but he could not eliminate the gap between 2 shots. In close-range combat, that gap was long enough for a mounted warrior to cross dozens of yards. The more powerful bullet. If the Springfield fired more slowly than the Spencer, it had to offer something valuable enough for the Army to accept the trade-off. That advantage was the cartridge. The new Springfield system used the government's .45 caliber ammunition. The infantry rifle version was commonly associated with the designation 4570, meaning a .45 caliber bullet propelled by approximately 70 grains of black powder. For the lighter cavalry carbine, The powder charge was reduced to approximately 55 grains to limit recoil. For that reason, specialized sources often refer to the carbine cartridge as the 45-55. In many books and museums, however, the entire system is still generally described as the Springfield 45-70. Those two designations sometimes make viewers believe the sources contradict one another. In reality, they describe two powder loads within the same family of ammunition. The Springfield bullet was heavier, more powerful, and retained its energy better at long range than the 44 rimfire cartridge used in the Henry or Winchester Model 1866. When it struck a person or a horse, it could cause devastating injuries. It also allowed a soldier to fire effectively at distances where many smaller caliber repeating firearms began losing accuracy and power. If the enemy appeared on an open hillside several hundred yards away, the Springfield was a formidable weapon. If the soldier had time to aim a clear field of fire and comrades who maintained the formation, the single-shot carbine could turn the ground ahead into a killing zone. That was the battlefield the Springfield had been selected to dominate. But it was not the battlefield Custer would encounter 2 years later. The fear that soldiers would run out of ammunition. The Army had another reason to distrust repeating firearms. The faster a weapon fired, the faster its ammunition disappeared. A soldier carrying a Spencer or Winchester might continue firing under stress even when no clear target was visible. Within only a few minutes, the ammunition he carried could be exhausted. For a unit operating near a railroad or supply depot, that problem could still be corrected. But on the Plains Reserve, ammunition was often carried in wagons or on pack mules that might be miles behind the firing line. The ammunition horses could panic. The supply train could be blocked. The ammunition crates could remain in the rear at the exact moment the soldiers at the front needed them most. Many officers believed that a single-shot firearm would force soldiers to select their targets more carefully, fire fewer rounds, aim more carefully, preserve ammunition for the decisive moment. That argument was not entirely unreasonable. A repeating firearm in the hands of an undisciplined soldier could turn hundreds of cartridges into smoke without producing any result. But that argument also depended on an assumption: that the soldier would always have time to aim carefully, that the enemy would not suddenly appear at close range, that the formation would not collapse before disciplined fire could take effect. At Little Bighorn, all three assumptions failed. Did Custer oppose the new guns? An appealing image often appears in modern accounts. Custer, a man who understood repeating firearms, was supposedly frustrated when the Army forced his soldiers to carry single-shot Springfields. But the evidence does not allow us to portray him as a reformer who foresaw the coming disaster. Custer understood the value of repeating firearms. He had commanded soldiers armed with Spencers. Tom Custer and others around him had carried Winchesters. He had compared firearms during hunting expeditions. But Custer also admired powerful and accurate single-shot rifles. He praised his sporting Springfield. He was pleased with his Remington Rolling Block. To him, the fact that a firearm held only one cartridge did not make it outdated or useless. Custer appears to have believed in placing the shot correctly. He believed in long-range accuracy. Like many officers of his generation, he may have considered disciplined formation and courage more important than rate of fire alone. The problem was not that he failed to understand firearms. The problem was that understanding a weapon on a shooting range was completely different from predicting how it would perform when more than 1,000 warriors were advancing through ravines hidden from view. Black Hills, the new gun enters forbidden land. In the summer of 1874, Custer led a large expedition into the Black Hills. Under the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, the region lay within territory guaranteed to the Lakota. But Custer's expedition entered it anyway. The stated purpose was to survey the terrain, locate possible sites for military posts, and gather scientific information. The expedition included engineers, geologists, reporters, hunters, and hundreds of soldiers. This was not a small unit moving quietly through the forest. It was a long military column carrying wagons, livestock equipment, tents, and the new Springfields. That image carried a meaning larger than the firearm itself. The Springfield Model 1873 was not merely a carbine issued to cavalrymen. It represented an army becoming more standardized, more organized, and confident enough to enter lands that had once been promised to someone else. Every new gun was the same. Every cartridge pouch was standardized. Every soldier was trained to follow the same procedure. It was the power of an industrial state moving westward. But beneath that modern appearance were exhausted and hungry men who still depended on horses, water, and an extremely long supply line. As the expedition moved deeper into the Black Hills, the soldiers crossed steep slopes, dense pine forests, and cold streams. The new Springfield endured dust impacts and weather under real field conditions. It was carried on horseback, placed beside campfires, and cleaned at the end of the day. The weapon was occasionally used for hunting, but the expedition did not encounter a major battle. The Black Hills campaign therefore did not prove what the Springfield could do when an entire regiment came under attack. It only gave the army the impression that the new system was working. Then, gold was discovered. The news spread faster than any military order. Gold seekers began flooding into the Black Hills. Wagon trains entered the territory that the government had once promised to protect from white intrusion. Tensions increased. The Springfield had entered the Black Hills as a weapon protecting a survey expedition. Only 2 years later, it returned north during a military campaign, intended to force Lakota and Cheyenne groups that had not entered the reservations to surrender. An expedition helped open the door. A gold rush pushed it wider. Then the army stepped through it. The new Colt in the holster. The Springfield was not the only new weapon to appear in the 7th Cavalry. During the same period, the Colt Single-Action Army Model 1873 began replacing the Colt 1860 and Remington 1858 percussion revolvers. The difference was enormous. At Washita, soldiers had to load powder, a bullet, and a percussion cap separately into every chamber of their revolvers. With the new Colt, each cartridge already contained the bullet powder and primer inside a complete metallic case. The soldier opened the loading gate on the side of the gun, inserted each cartridge into the cylinder, and closed the gate. 6 cartridges. 6 shots before reloading. Before every shot, the user had to pull the hammer back manually. That was why the weapon was called single action. It could not fire as quickly as a double-action revolver operated by simply pulling the trigger. But it was powerful, durable, and suited to harsh conditions. At close range, the Colt 45 could become a life-saving weapon when there was no time to reload the Springfield. The soldier fired his carbine. The enemy continued advancing. He opened the breech, but no longer had time to retrieve another cartridge. At that moment, his hand could leave the long gun and reach for the revolver in his holster. That was the plan. The Springfield controlled the distance. The Colt dealt with the threat that had already come close. But the plan worked only while the soldier remained calm, still had access to his holster, and was not being attacked from several directions at once. 6 rounds sounded like a large number during a duel. Inside an encirclement, they disappeared very quickly. The sabers left behind. The 7th Cavalry Regiment still possessed sabers. But during the campaign of 1876, those long and heavy swords were left behind. The decision had practical reasons. Sabers created noise during a march. They caught on saddles and brush. During warfare on the plains, many officers believed that carbines and revolvers were more useful than swords designed for traditional cavalry charges. Leaving the sabers behind made the men and horses lighter. But it also removed the 3rd layer of weapons that had been present at Washita. At Little Bighorn, when the carbine required time to reload and the 6 revolver rounds had been fired, the soldiers no longer had long swords available for close combat. That does not mean sabers could have saved Custer's 5 companies. No sword could reverse an encirclement involving such a severe numerical imbalance. But the absence of sabers shows that the 7th Cavalry of 1876 did not enter battle with the same 3-layer weapon system used at Washita. This time they depended almost entirely on ammunition. Most of the reserve ammunition was not carried by the men riding with Custer. It remained behind with the pack train. A good gun needs the right battlefield. The Springfield Model 1873 is often turned into the villain of the Little Bighorn story. It fired slowly. It was said to suffer stuck cartridge cases. It faced Henry and Winchester repeating firearms. From those facts, Many people conclude that Custer's men were destroyed because they carried a bad gun. But that explanation is too simple. The Springfield was not a bad gun. It was a firearm optimized for a particular type of combat. It needed distance. It needed visible targets. It needed a stable formation. It needed soldiers to alternate their fire and cover one another during the gaps required for reloading. A company arranged in line, firing in sequence, and protected on both flanks could use the Springfield very effectively. But a soldier separated from his comrades on a hillside received none of those advantages. He had only one cartridge in the chamber, one ammunition pouch, and several long seconds between shots. This is the point to remember as the story moves closer to Little Bighorn. No weapon is powerful or weak under every condition. The Henry could fire rapidly, but its bullet was lighter and its effective range was limited. The Springfield was more powerful at long range, but slower when the enemy moved close. The Colt was convenient during the final few yards, but it held only 6 rounds. The saber required no ammunition, but it was nearly useless while the enemy remained beyond reach. The battlefield determined which weapon became the most dangerous. The commander determined which battlefield his soldiers entered. Before the first gunshot. By early 1876, the 7th Cavalry Regiment appeared to be a modern military force. The soldiers carried Springfield Trapdoor Carbines. Colt .45 revolvers rested inside their holsters. The ammunition had been standardized. The companies had years of experience marching across the plains. Custer also possessed his own firearms. He understood long-range shooting. He understood the power of a large bullet. He understood the appeal of the Winchester and the advantage of repeating fire. On paper, this was not an inexperienced unit or a force lacking firepower, but an equipment list could not measure the size of the village they were about to encounter. It could not reveal how many warriors were gathering beside the Little Bighorn River. It could not show the ravines that would conceal approaching men. It could not predict how many separate detachments Custer would create from the regiment. And it could not warn that the firearm best suited for long-range shooting might be pulled into a battle fought at only a few dozen steps. 2 years before the final battle, the Springfield entered the Black Hills with Custer as a symbol of a confident army. 2 years later, hundreds of its cartridge cases would lie scattered across the hills of Montana. Beside them would be ammunition from Henry rifles, Winchesters, Sharps rifles, Spencers, muzzle-loading firearms, and dozens of other weapons. The Army entered the battle with a nearly standardized weapon system. The Lakota and Cheyenne entered it with a mixed arsenal that no military ordnance officer would have wanted to manage. But that mixture created an unexpected advantage. Each weapon was suited to a different range. As hundreds of warriors closed the circle, the rapid fire of some guns, the power of others, and their users' knowledge of the terrain began to complement one another. Little Bighorn was therefore not a duel between two guns. It was a collision between two methods of creating firepower. One side depended on standardization discipline and powerful shots delivered from military formations. The other depended on movement terrain and dozens of weapons acquired through trade, captured as trophies, purchased through commerce, or drawn from the military surplus left after the Civil War. When those two systems collided on June 25, 1876, the firearm that appeared more modern on paper was not necessarily the one that controlled the battlefield. Little Bighorn, 2 standardized firearms against a mixed arsenal. On the morning of June 25, 1876, Custer had not yet seen the entire village. From the crow's nest, his Crow scouts pointed toward the Little Bighorn Valley. They saw smoke herds of horses and tiny movements across the distant ground that looked like worms crawling. They understood what it meant. A very large encampment lay below, but Custer could not see it as clearly as they could. Through his binoculars, he saw only vague patches of color, broken lines of earth, and a valley concealed by the terrain. He knew he had come close to the target, but he did not know exactly how many people were waiting ahead. That was the moment when every number began to become dangerous. The 7th Cavalry Regiment was experienced. The soldiers carried new weapons. Custer believed that if he attacked quickly enough, the encampment would scatter before the warriors had time to assemble. He had done it before, at Washita. But the Little Bighorn Valley did not contain one small village. It contained multiple Lakota and Cheyenne camp circles stretching along the river. Thousands of people were there. Alongside them were thousands of horses and a force of warriors far larger than Custer had expected. During the hours that followed, two completely different weapon systems would collide. One side was nearly standardized. The other was so mixed that it appeared chaotic. Yet it was the seemingly chaotic force that took control of the battlefield. The Army's two firearms. If you stepped into the ranks of the 7th Cavalry that morning, you would see that most soldiers carried two primary firearms: the Springfield Model 1873 Trapdoor Carbine and the Colt Single Action Army Model 1873. The Springfield rested on the saddle or was held in the soldier's hands. The Colt sat inside a holster at his side. Both weapons used ammunition standardized by the Army. The soldiers were trained under the same procedures. When one man fell, a comrade could take cartridges from his pouch and use them in his own weapon. On paper, that was a major advantage. There was no need to guess which ammunition would fit. There was no concern that one company carried different guns from the company beside it. The supply train did not need to transport dozens of different ammunition types. Every man knew what he carried. Every cartridge had its place. Every movement had been practiced. But standardization did not mean flexibility. The Springfield held one cartridge in the chamber. The Colt held 6 rounds in its cylinder. After that, the soldier had to reload. If the formation remained intact, some men could cover the others. One line could fire while another prepared. Officers could control the rate of fire and preserve ammunition for clearly visible targets. But when the formation was divided, every soldier had to protect the gap between his own shots. And Custer had divided the regiment before the battle truly began. Benteen was sent to scout toward the south. Reno was ordered to lead 3 companies into the valley and attack the encampment. The ammunition pack train and its escort remained behind. Custer kept 5 companies and moved across the high ground east of the river. Each detachment moved farther from the others. Hills, ravines, and bends in the Little Bighorn cut off their lines of sight. A regiment that could once have concentrated hundreds of Springfields on the same target had become separate groups of men who did not know exactly what was happening to the others. And below them, in the valley, the village began to awaken. 47 types of weapons without an ordnance depot. The Lakota and Cheyenne did not have an issuance system like the United States Army. There were no ordnance officers walking along the lines to make sure everyone used the same ammunition. There was no central depot ensuring that every warrior carried the same model of gun. Their weapons came from many sources: trade with merchants, gifts distributed from treaties, older firearms sold after the Civil War, weapons captured during previous engagements, hunting guns purchased with animal hides, horses, or other property. As a result, an old muzzle-loading firearm could appear on the same battlefield beside a repeating Henry rifle. One warrior carried an old Spencer from the Civil War. Another had a Winchester Model 1866. One used a Sharps. The man beside him might carry only a revolver, a bow and arrows, or a firearm that had been repaired many times. From a military perspective, it was a logistical nightmare. But Little Bighorn was not a months-long campaign requiring continuous resupply. The battle was taking place beside their own village. Warriors could obtain more ammunition, exchange firearms, or return to another weapon when necessary. More importantly, they were not required to fight in one fixed formation. Archaeology later identified approximately 47 different types of weapons in the hands of native forces. That number does not mean that all 47 types were more modern than the Springfield. Many were older. Some fired more slowly. Some had shorter effective ranges. But within that mixture were Henry and Winchester rifles, capable of firing repeated shots at close range. There were 50-70 firearms powerful enough to cause severe wounds. There were revolvers that were convenient during close combat. There were weapons suited to their users and to the distances they chose. The arsenal was not standardized, but the people using it understood the terrain. At Little Bighorn, that mattered more than the neat appearance of a military weapons issuance list. Reno fires into a village that is becoming an army. Reno led approximately 140 soldiers directly into the valley. At first, they advanced on horseback. Then Reno ordered them to dismount and deploy in a skirmish line. Under cavalry procedure, roughly 1 man out of every 4 held the horses. That reduced the number of guns directly present on the firing line. Ahead of them were lodges women running to find children, horses being driven away, and warriors rushing to retrieve weapons. During the opening minutes, Reno still held the initiative. The Springfields fired across the open ground. Their powerful bullets could reach the targets ahead. But the encampment did not scatter as the army expected. It contracted, then struck back. Warriors began appearing from the lodges, the trees, and areas Reno could not control. The number of men in front of him increased by the minute. The distance narrowed. Gunfire no longer came only from the front, it came from both sides. Then, it came from behind. Reno withdrew into a wooded area beside the river. The trees provided cover, but they also crowded the formation and made observation more difficult. A scout named Bloody Knife stood near Reno and was shot in the head. Blood and brain matter splattered across the major. After that moment, the orders became confused. Mount. Dismount. Mount again. Retreat. Imagine a soldier trying to reload his Springfield in that scene. The horses pulled against their reins. The man beside him ran past. An officer shouted, but his voice disappeared beneath the gunfire. The soldier opened the breech, but his hands were trembling, and the hot cartridge case might not fall free immediately. He reached for a new round. But the formation had already begun to move. The Springfield was just as powerful as it had been a few minutes earlier. Only the battlefield around it had changed. Reno finally retreated across the river in confusion, leaving dead and wounded men behind. He climbed onto the high ground, where he later joined Benteen and the ammunition pack train. Reno had survived, but driving him from the valley released hundreds of warriors. They no longer had to concentrate entirely on Reno's 3 companies. They could turn their horses northward, toward the place where Custer was moving, unaware of how quickly the pressure behind him had increased. The guns that moved across the battlefield. More than a century later, a major fire burned away the thick grass covering Little Bighorn. The ground was exposed. Archaeologists began walking in horizontal lines, carrying metal detectors, and marking every artifact before removing it from its location. They were not searching only for guns. Most of the firearms had disappeared long before. What remained were the objects shooters had dropped without having time to recover them. Cartridge cases, unfired cartridges, deformed bullets, metal fragments from firearms or equipment. Thousands of small objects were placed on a map. At first, they looked like isolated dots. But when the firing pin marks on the cartridge cases were compared under microscopes, the dots began to connect. No 2 firing pins struck in exactly the same way. The breech face left its own tiny lines and impressions on the base of a cartridge case. The extractor could also produce distinctive marks. 2 cartridge cases of the same caliber did not necessarily come from the same firearm. But when several microscopic features matched, they could be considered consistent with having been fired from the same weapon. That was when the battlefield began moving again. Some 44 rimfire cartridge cases were discovered at widely separated locations. The marks suggested that they had probably been fired from the same Henry or Winchester Model 1866. That gun had not remained in one place. It appeared in one area, then appeared again farther across the battlefield. The man carrying it may have fired, mounted his horse, moved through a ravine, and continued shooting from another position. His name was gone. His face was gone. Only the brass cartridge cases remained beneath the soil. But the path of his gun was still there. You can think of those cases as footprints made of metal. Every shot marked a moment. The shooter stopped, raised his weapon, worked the lever, aimed at a group of soldiers on the hillside, then moved again. That is what paintings of the Last Stand fail to show. They usually freeze everyone in one place. Custer stands in the center. The soldiers form a circle. The enemy surrounds them. But the evidence beneath the ground shows a battle that was always moving. Groups of Custer's soldiers withdrew, regrouped, and were pushed back again. Lakota and Cheyenne warriors moved through low ground, changed positions, and concentrated against weak points. There was no single moment that continued until everyone was dead. There were several collapses, one after another. The terrain concealed hundreds of men. From Last Stand Hill, the view appears wide. Standing on the high ground, you can look across the valley, see the river winding below, and watch the lines of hills stretching toward the south. That was why the Army preferred elevated ground. Higher ground meant seeing farther, firing farther, and being more difficult to surprise. But Little Bighorn was not a flat surface. Between the hilltops were ravines, erosion gullies, and low areas deep enough to conceal a mounted man. From above, those areas disappeared. You could see only the edge of the ground in front of you, and another hillside in the distance. Everything between them was completely hidden from view. Researchers mapped the areas that Custer's men could see from their defensive positions. They then compared those fields of view with the places where native cartridge cases were discovered. Many of the cases lay inside those dead spaces. They were places the soldiers in the hilltops could not observe. Warriors could advance through ravines, stop below the edge of the ground, and then appear at a distance far closer than Custer's men expected. The Springfield had been chosen for its range, but range was useless against an opponent you could not see. By the time the warriors appeared, the long distance had disappeared. That was when the Henry and Winchester became dangerous. Their .44 caliber bullets were lighter than the Springfield's projectile. They were less powerful at long range. But when the target was only a few dozen yards away, the ability to work the lever and fire again quickly could matter more than the superior power of one bullet. A warrior could fire, keep the rifle near his shoulder, work the lever, then fire again before the Springfield soldier completed the reloading process. Not every warrior carried a repeating firearm, but only a few needed to have them in the right position for local firepower to become overwhelming. There was no single last stand. Custer's 5 companies appeared to have gathered near Calhoun Hill before spreading farther along the ridgelines. Company L and Company C held the southern area. Captain Miles Keogh and Company I occupied an intermediate position. Custer and the remaining companies continued moving north. In theory, the arrangement created supporting positions. If Calhoun came under pressure, Keogh could help. If Custer was blocked, Keogh could move forward. If one detachment needed to withdraw, the positions behind it could provide cover. But on the ground, distance and terrain turned those supporting positions into islands. Company C appears to have attempted an attack into a ravine to break up the force advancing toward them. The company suffered heavy casualties and could not return to the formation intact. At Calhoun Hill, Springfield, cartridge cases were concentrated around the position where soldiers had held the line. At first, they may have fired in formation, but the distribution of artifacts shows that the position did not last long. Once the line was penetrated, the battle was no longer a series of controlled volleys. It became a series of short retreats between high points. Some men tried to reach Keogh's position. Others fell along the ridgeline. Horses were shot, ran away, or dragged equipment with them. Ammunition pouches fell to the ground. Unfired cartridges lay beside empty cases. Farther north, Custer and the remaining men were pushed toward the ground later called Last Stand Hill. That name makes it seem as though the entire battle happened there. In reality, it was only the most recognizable final point in a chain of collapses stretching for nearly a mile. Custer did not have 210 men standing around him on the final hill. By then, the force had already been divided into smaller groups. Several of the southern companies may already have collapsed. The men who reached Custer's area were only the final portion of a formation being compressed. The heroic image in paintings shows soldiers holding a neat circle. The ground reveals something more painful. They did not all die at the same time. They were separated, lost the ability to support one another, and were destroyed in groups. Did the guns jam in large numbers? One of the most famous explanations for Custer's defeat is that the Springfield suffered stuck cartridge cases. According to that story, the soft brass cases expanded from the heat and became lodged inside the chamber. Soldiers had to use knives or tools to pry them free, while the opposing warriors continued advancing. Some incidents like that may have occurred. Black powder firearms accumulated heavy fouling. The chambers became dirty. Early brass cartridge cases could develop problems. Stress could cause users to operate the action incorrectly. But archaeology does not support the image of all 5 companies suddenly losing large numbers of Springfields at the same time. Cartridge cases bearing extraction marks do exist, but not in numbers sufficient to explain the destruction of the entire force. The soldiers continued firing heavily. Springfield cases appeared across the defensive positions and retreat routes. The guns continued working until their users were driven from their positions, ran out of ammunition, lost their weapons, or were killed. The larger problem was not that every Springfield failed. The larger problem was that a single-shot carbine was being used inside a collapsing formation against opponents who moved quickly and approached from directions the soldiers could not control. It is easy to blame the metal. Metal cannot defend itself. But a firearm did not divide the regiment. It did not send Benteen far away. It did not drive Reno into the valley and then abandon him there. It did not lead 5 companies across the hills without maintaining reliable communication with the ammunition train behind them. The Springfield had limitations, but those limitations became catastrophic only after human decisions placed the weapon in the worst possible situation, when firepower was no longer a number. Before the battle, firearms could be compared through technical specifications: rate of fire, range, bullet weight, magazine capacity. But on the battlefield, firepower was not merely the number of rounds a gun could fire in 1 minute. It was the number of firearms able to see the same target. It was the number of men calm enough to reload. It was whether comrades stood close enough to protect the gap between shots. It was whether the terrain blocked the line of fire. It was the location of the reserve ammunition. It was whether an officer could still deliver orders when gunfire came from every direction. The Army had standardized weapons, but its forces were divided. The Lakota and Cheyenne had non-standardized firearms, but they concentrated increasing numbers of warriors against Custer's weakest positions. That was the paradox of Little Bighorn. The more orderly military system lost the ability to function as a system. The more varied arsenal became connected by terrain speed and one common objective: protecting the village below. When the final gunfire faded, hundreds of Springfield's Colts Henrys, Winchesters, Sharps rifles, and other types of weapons had passed through the battlefield. But among all those firearms, only a few would inspire more debate than the others. Custer's long gun, the 2 revolvers believed to have rested in his holsters, and the question no one can answer completely. What was he really holding during the final minutes? What did Custer carry into his final battle? When Custer's body was found, no famous firearm lay beside him to end the debate. There was no case bearing the manufacturer's name. There was no recorded serial number. There was no survivor standing beside him who could say when he had seen the commander switch from a rifle to a revolver. There was only the body, a bullet wound near the heart, a wound to the head, and the empty space where his personal weapons may once have been. That empty space has remained for nearly 150 years. It has allowed every generation to place the gun it wants to believe in Custer's hands. Painters choose revolvers because they create a dramatic pose. Movies choose 2 guns so the character can fire in both directions. Collectors choose a specific Webley and then try to connect it to the battlefield. Hunting rifle enthusiasts place a Remington Rolling Block in his hands because Custer once praised it. But when the images are set aside and only the evidence remains, the list becomes much shorter. The 50-70 Remington. The strongest candidate for Custer's personal long gun during the final campaign is the 50-70 Remington Rolling Block sporting rifle. Custer definitely owned such a Remington. He had written to the manufacturer praising its accuracy and effectiveness after hunting trips in the American West. This was not a gun connected to him simply because its appearance seemed appropriate. Custer mentioned it directly. He used it, he trusted it, and a man preparing to enter country where he might encounter bears, buffalo, antelope, or combat had every reason to carry the powerful firearm with which he was most familiar. The Rolling Block had a long octagonal barrel, longer than a standard carbine. It fired a large 50-70 cartridge. It was not fast, but it was powerful. When a target was far away and the shooter had time to select his point of aim, the Remington could accomplish something that the shorter Springfield carbine could not achieve with the same confidence. Custer may have regarded it as a weapon for deliberate shots. A warrior on a ridgeline. A distant horse. A target against which a lighter bullet would struggle to retain energy. The archaeological presentation on Little Bighorn also mentions Custer carrying a 50-70 rolling block as his personal sporting weapon. That makes it highly plausible that the Remington accompanied him during the 1876 campaign. But pay close attention to how the conclusion must be written. Custer very likely carried the 50-70 Remington Rolling Block during his final campaign. Not this. Archaeology proved that Custer fired the Remington on Last Stand Hill. A vast gulf of evidence separates those two statements. Why can a 50-70 cartridge case not be attributed to Custer? Suppose a 50-70 cartridge case were found near the location of Custer's body. Would that be enough to say that he fired it? No, the 50-70 caliber did not belong exclusively to Custer. Many types of firearms using that cartridge circulated throughout the American West. Older military firearms, hunting rifles, rolling blocks, Sharps rifles, weapons sold, traded, or issued after the Civil War. A Lakota or Cheyenne warrior could also have carried a 50-70 firearm. Another officer might have owned a weapon of the same caliber. The cartridge case could have fallen there at another time. Or it could have been moved by people, animals, or weather after the battle. To attribute the case to Custer, researchers would need his original Remington. They would need to know with certainty that the firearm belonged to him during the campaign. Then, they would have to compare its firing pin, marks, breech face impressions, and extractor marks with the cases found on the battlefield. But the Remington disappeared. There is no gun available for comparison. There is no unbroken chain of ownership. There is no forensic evidence connecting a specific brass case to Custer's hand. We can therefore place the rolling block in his campaign with a high level of confidence. But we cannot follow it all the way to his final shot. The gun may not have been in Custer's hands. There is another possibility that is often overlooked. Custer may have carried the rolling block during the campaign without personally holding it when the battle began. As the story of Tuttle at Yellowstone demonstrated, an officer's personal long gun could be carried by an orderly. Custer had to ride, study the terrain, and issue orders. He used binoculars. He spoke with scouts. He moved between companies. A long hunting rifle heavier than a carbine could become an obstacle during hours of rapid movement. An orderly or a member of the command group may have carried the Remington until Custer needed it. If that man became separated from him, was killed, or lost his horse, the rifle may never have reached Last Stand Hill. So even if the Remington was definitely part of the campaign equipment, that still would not prove it was beside Custer during the final minutes. Once again, ownership, transportation, and use are three different things. Popular history often combines them into one. The evidence forces us to separate them. The two British revolvers. If Custer's long gun has one clear candidate, his handguns are far less certain. Edward Godfrey, an officer of the 7th Cavalry, who survived because he remained with the Reno-Benteen Force, later described Custer as carrying two British revolvers. According to his memory, they had self-cocking actions. They had light-colored grips. They had lanyard rings at the bottom. Godfrey called them bulldogs. The description sounds specific, but the more closely it is examined, the more problems it creates. Self-cocking suggests that the guns may have been double-action revolvers. The shooter only needed to pull the trigger for the cylinder to rotate and the hammer to cock, rather than manually cocking the hammer before every shot, as with the Colt single-action army. In close combat, that was a significant advantage. The user could draw the gun and fire more quickly. There was no need to change the position of the hand to cock the hammer. If Custer truly carried two double-action revolvers, the choice reveals something about him. He may have prioritized speed in his handguns, while still preferring power and accuracy in his long guns. But Bulldog does not give us a definite model. Today, the name British Bulldog usually suggests a family of small, short-barreled revolvers produced by Webley and other manufacturers. The problem is that the famous model is generally associated with a date after 1876. If that is correct, Custer could not have carried the version most modern people imagine. Godfrey may have used a later popular name to describe an older gun. He may have remembered the model incorrectly, or it may not have been a British Bulldog in the technical sense, but another British revolver with a similar appearance, Webley Rick or something else. One frequently mentioned candidate is the Webley Rick. Rick stands for Royal Irish Constabulary. This was a double-action revolver that definitely existed before 1876. It was sturdy, more compact than a long military revolver, and could be fitted with a lanyard ring. A Webley Rick therefore fits several parts of Godfrey's account. A British gun, double action, possibly fitted with a lanyard ring, suitable as a personal sidearm. But not every detail matches perfectly. The light-colored grips could have been ivory bone or another custom material. Not every Rick had the same configuration. There is also no receipt serial number or surviving revolver with an unbroken ownership history proving that it belonged to Custer. Another candidate is the Galland and Somerville, or a similar British-Belgian revolver. Those firearms also had double-action mechanisms and appeared during the appropriate period. But every theory contains at least one mismatch. The name fits, but the date creates doubt. The action fits, but the grip shape does not. The caliber is plausible, but there is no documented provenance. The most honest conclusion is therefore this. Custer probably carried a pair of British or European double-action revolvers with light-colored grips. The exact model has never been identified. Why did Custer carry two guns? If Godfrey's account is accurate, why did Custer need two revolvers? A revolver was not easy to reload during a battle. Even a metallic cartridge model required the user to open the loading gate, eject each empty case, and insert each new cartridge into the cylinder. With the enemy closing in, that process was almost impractical. Carrying two guns gave Custer another loaded cylinder, 6 rounds in the first revolver, possibly 5 or 6 more in the second, depending on how the user loaded it, for safety. When the first gun was empty, he only had to switch hands or draw the other revolver. It was a simple solution to the problem of slow reloading. It was not an invention unique to Custer. Many people in the American West carried multiple guns for the same reason. But two revolvers also created an image that fit the legend almost perfectly. One man inside an encirclement, a gun in each hand, firing in 2 directions. Because that image is so powerful, we must be even more cautious. Custer may have carried 2 revolvers, but there is no evidence that he fought with both at the same time. No witness saw him fire until both cylinders were empty. No one knows whether he had time to draw the second gun. One may have remained inside a saddlebag. One may have been lost when a horse fell. Both may have been taken from his body before the army arrived. Between carrying 2 revolvers and dying with a gun in each hand lies an empty space that painters filled with imagination. Not the pearl-gripped Smith & Wessons. Custer definitely owned the pair of pearl-gripped Smith & Wesson No. 2 Army revolvers. But light-colored grips are not enough to make them the revolvers Godfrey described. The Smith & Wesson No. 2 fired the .32 rimfire cartridge. They were not British revolvers. Their actions and dimensions also did not fully match the description of the guns carried during the final campaign. No strong evidence places them at Little Bighorn. Custer may have carried them on other occasions. He may have fired them for practice. They may have appeared in his baggage at some point. But may have is not enough to place them in the final minutes. A painting showing Custer at Little Bighorn with 2 pearl-gripped Smith & Wessons may therefore be beautiful. It may also be wrong. Not the Creedmoor. The Remington Ryder Creedmoor target rifle must also be excluded from the final battle. The evidence allows us to say this more firmly. Custer owned the Creedmoor. It was a finely made target rifle, but it did not accompany him during the 1876 campaign. It survived after Custer's death. It was therefore not taken from Little Bighorn. It could not have been the long gun he carried on Last Stand Hill. Once again, a genuine artifact does not prove presence in a battle. The Creedmoor belonged to Custer, but it did not belong to the Little Bighorn story. No evidence that Custer used a standard Springfield. Most of the soldiers under his command carried the Springfield Model 1873 carbine. Did Custer carry one as well? Possibly. An officer could use a standard carbine when necessary. The ammunition was available, the weapon was familiar, the action was simple. But Custer owned personal long guns and often preferred more powerful sporting rifles. There is no firm evidence that he chose a standard Springfield carbine instead of the Remington during the final campaign. We should therefore not look at the hundreds of Springfield cases on the battlefield and assume that one of them must have been fired by Custer. Those cartridge cases prove that his soldiers fought. They do not identify the person who pulled the trigger. The final bullet. People often ask whom Custer struck with his final bullet. But even that question contains an unproven image. It assumes that Custer remained alive until the end, that he was still conscious enough to fight after the men around him had fallen, that he still held a gun, that the weapon still contained ammunition, that his final shot came immediately before he was killed. We do not know that sequence. Custer had 2 recorded wounds, 1 bullet wound in the chest near the heart, 1 wound to the head. No one knows which came first. If the bullet struck his chest early, he may have lost the ability to command or fight before the final formation collapsed. If the head wound came first, every story of him firing until the final second would be impossible. He may have been wounded while moving. He may have fallen from his horse. He may have been carried onto the hill by others. He may have died before some of the remaining soldiers. There is no evidence placing him at the center of a perfect circle. There is only the location of his body and the relatives, officers, and soldiers found around that area. The name Last Stand Hill makes it seem as though Custer deliberately made a final stand, but he may simply have been driven there with what remained of his force. Where did the weapons go? After the battle, Lakota and Cheyenne warriors collected valuable items. Guns, ammunition, clothing, boots, straps, living horses. Within plains warfare and the conditions of survival, taking an enemy's weapons was completely understandable. A powerful Remington had enormous value. 2 double-action revolvers were even more valuable. They may have been used afterward, traded to someone else, confiscated when native groups surrendered, placed inside military storage without anyone knowing their origin, passed through many owners, or damaged, stripped for parts, and lost completely. During the question and answer section of the archaeological presentation, Douglas Scott said that he had examined hundreds of firearms claimed to be connected to Little Bighorn. Only a very small percentage could be reliably linked to cartridge cases from the battlefield. Guns surrendered early to military depots had greater research value because they were less likely to have been altered. Privately owned firearms, however, may have undergone repeated firing pin replacements, breech face repairs, barrel changes, or extractor replacements. Replacing only one component could erase the marks needed for forensic comparison. Any firearm appearing at auction with the claim that it may have been Custer's gun must therefore be viewed with extreme suspicion. An oral story is not a chain of provenance. A gun from the correct period is not battlefield evidence. A similar-looking scratch is not enough for identification, and a high sale price does not make history more accurate. Did Custer actually fight? It is highly likely that he personally used a weapon at Little Bighorn. Custer was not a man who usually remained far from the fighting. From Gettysburg to the Western campaigns, he repeatedly appeared near the front. When his 5 companies were surrounded, there is no reason to believe that he never fired a shot. But highly likely is still different from proven. We do not know whether he used the long gun or the revolver first. We do not know whether the Remington ever reached his hands. We do not know whether one of the revolvers was lost while moving. We do not know whether he fired one shot or many. We do not know whether the weapon jammed, ran out of ammunition, or was still loaded when it was taken. Sometimes history refuses to answer, not because researchers failed to try. It refuses because the evidence left the battlefield with the victors. 3 levels of truth. At this point, we can divide Custer's weapons during the final campaign into 3 levels. What has been confirmed? Custer owned a 50-70 Remington Rolling Block. He used and praised that rifle. The 7th Cavalry used the Springfield Model 1873, and the Colt Single-Action Army. Custer owned many other firearms, but not all of them accompanied him. What is highly probable? The 50-70 Rolling Block was carried during the 1876 campaign. Custer carried a pair of British or European double-action revolvers with light-colored grips. He personally used at least one weapon when the 5 companies came under attack. What cannot be proven? The exact revolver model, the number of shots Custer fired, which weapon was in his hands when he was wounded, whether a specific cartridge case was fired by him, whether he truly died last. This is not an uninteresting conclusion. It is the most fascinating part of the story. The gap between what we know and what we want to believe is exactly where legends are born. The gun could not save the commander. Suppose Custer truly had the 50-70 Remington. Suppose he carried 2 fully loaded double-action revolvers. He was still only one man. A rolling block offered one shot before it had to be reloaded. 2 revolvers provided several more rounds at close range. They might kill or wound a few opponents. They could not reunite companies that had already been separated. They could not call Reno back into the valley. They could not make Benteen arrive at the correct moment. They could not move the ammunition pack train across the terrain any faster. They could not see through the ravines where warriors were approaching. They could not transform 210 scattered men into a unified regiment. This is where the story of the final gun often directs our attention toward the wrong thing. We focus on the object in Custer's hands, but the outcome was determined across the entire battlefield. The distance between the companies, the size of the village, the movement of hundreds of warriors after Reno was driven back, the low ground that blocked visibility, the reserve ammunition positioned behind them, and Custer's belief that speed could still create shock as it had at Gettysburg or Washita. No personal firearm could correct all of those problems. The final empty space. More than a century later, archaeologists could trace a Henry rifle moving across the battlefield. They could examine firing pin marks and say that 2 cartridge cases were consistent with having been fired from the same weapon. They could identify where a group of soldiers held a position, where a defensive line collapsed, where native warriors used low ground to approach. But they could not place Custer's name on a cartridge case. The gun required to make that comparison had disappeared. Custer's final bullet, therefore, still has no confirmed caliber, no confirmed firearm model, no confirmed target. Only possibilities remain. It may have been a 50-70 round from the Remington. It may have been a 442 round from a British revolver. It may have been another caliber. Or Custer may never have had the opportunity to fire the final bullet that legend always reserves for him. That is the difference between a death in a painting and a death on a battlefield. In paintings, the hero always knows that the final moment has arrived. He stands upright, selects a target, fires the last shot, then falls. On the battlefield, death may come in the middle of an unfinished command, while mounting a horse as a hand reaches for a holster, or before the soldier understands that the formation beside him has disappeared. Custer once owned beautiful guns. He praised their power and accuracy. He commanded soldiers carrying everything from 7-shot Spencers to single-shot Springfields. But Little Bighorn did not ask whether he possessed the best firearm. It asked how many men remained close enough to fight together. And by the time the answer became clear, every gun in his hands was already too late. Did Custer really lose because of his weapons? After all the guns, cartridge cases, and accounts buried beneath nearly 150 years of dust, we return to the simplest question. Did Custer lose because his men carried inferior weapons? The most appealing answer is yes. It is neat. It is easy to understand, and it almost turns Little Bighorn into a technological equation. On one side were United States soldiers carrying single-shot Springfields. On the other were Lakota and Cheyenne warriors carrying Henrys and Winchesters, capable of firing repeatedly. The faster gun defeated the slower gun. End of story. But the battlefield was not that simple. The Springfield was not a useless gun. The Springfield Model 1873 had one obvious weakness. After every shot, the soldier had to open the breech and reload. But calling it a bad weapon simply because it fired more slowly than a Winchester means judging the gun without considering the purpose for which it was designed. The Springfield fired a more powerful bullet. It offered good accuracy at long range, its action was simple, it was easy to teach, and when a company maintained its formation, soldiers could alternate their fire and sustain a continuous volume of gunfire. Imagine a stable line of troops on a hillside. One group fired, another reloaded. The officers maintained the rhythm, comrades protected both flanks. The enemy had to cross open ground while visible from a distance. Under those conditions, the Springfield could become a terrifying weapon. Its heavy bullet could tear through a body, shatter bone, or bring down a horse before the enemy came close enough to use a revolver or a smaller caliber repeating firearm effectively. The problem at Little Bighorn was not that the Springfield could not kill. It did kill. Archaeological evidence, native accounts, and the casualties from the battle all show that the soldiers of the 7th Cavalry fought fiercely. The problem was that the soldiers could not maintain the conditions the weapon needed to reveal its full strength. There was no longer a stable firing line. There were no longer protected flanks. There was no longer a commander who could see the entire battlefield. And eventually there were no longer enough comrades standing close enough to protect one another during the gaps between shots. The Winchester was not carried by every native warrior. Another myth exists on the opposite side. Not every Lakota and Cheyenne warrior carried a Winchester. Many used older firearms. There were muzzle-loading guns, there were surplus carbines from the Civil War, there were revolvers, there were Sharps rifles, Spencers, and many weapons that had been repaired, traded, or passed through several owners. Some warriors still carried bows and arrows alongside their guns. The native arsenal was not standardized, and not every weapon fired more quickly than the Springfield. But they did not need everyone to carry a Winchester. Only a small number of men with repeating firearms had to appear in the right position at the right time and close enough to the target for the difference to become clear. A Henry or Winchester inside a ravine only a few dozen yards from the soldier's line was far more dangerous than the same gun firing from several hundred yards away. The terrain allowed them to choose the distance. Their mobility allowed them to change positions. Their numbers allowed them to apply pressure from several directions at once. And the need to protect their families and the village below gave them a reason not to retreat. They were not fighting to capture a distant and unfamiliar land. They were fighting beside their lodges, horses, children, and relatives. That was not a technical advantage, but on the battlefield, it created a strength that no firearms table could measure. The mistake was not inside the chamber. If the Springfield was not the only cause what truly destroyed Custer's 5 companies, the answer lies in what happened before the first soldier ever needed to reload. Custer entered the battle without fully determining the size of the force ahead. He divided the regiment into several detachments. Reno attacked into the valley. Benteen was sent far to the south on a scouting mission. The pack train carrying most of the reserve ammunition remained behind. Custer led 5 companies across the high ground beyond the site of Reno and most of the remaining force. On a map, those advancing columns might have formed an encirclement. On the ground, they became distances that could not be crossed. Hills concealed other hills. Ravines swallowed the sound of gunfire. No one knew exactly where the other detachments were. No one could see the full number of warriors assembling. When Reno was driven out of the valley, hundreds of warriors were freed to move toward Custer. From that point onward, what happened along the ridgelines was no longer an organized attack. It became a struggle for individual positions between a divided force and an enemy growing larger by the minute. The Springfield did not create that situation. The Winchester did not create it by itself either. Command decisions placed the weapons in conditions that magnified both their strengths and weaknesses. Custer took the Springfield into a battle where the distance was constantly shrinking. He led 5 companies onto hills containing numerous dead zones in their fields of view. He depended on support from forces that could no longer see him. And he believed speed would preserve the initiative before the village had time to respond. But this time speed did not cause the enemy to panic. It only carried his men deeper into a place where no clear route of escape remained. The dangerous lesson from Gettysburg. At Gettysburg, Custer charged into an advancing force and won. He had comrades on both sides. He had supporting troops. He had a battle line that remained connected. The Spencers carried by some of his soldiers helped create rapid fire, but the victory did not come from rate of fire alone. It came from several units fighting together inside a system that remained intact. At Washita, Custer again relied on speed and surprise. He divided his force to surround the village and then attack before dawn. The attack achieved its military objective, but a detachment under Joel Elliott became separated and was destroyed. Custer withdrew without returning in time to save them. At Yellowstone, he clearly saw the difference between repeating firearms at close range and powerful rifles at long range. He understood that no single type of weapon was always superior under every condition. But his earlier victories taught Custer a lesson more dangerous than any technical specification. Boldness was often rewarded. Dividing a force could create surprise. Speed could compensate for incomplete information. A commander willing to move ahead could force history to follow him. That lesson had proven correct for him too many times, until the day it failed. Suppose Custer had Winchesters. Change one detail. Suppose every soldier in Custer's 5 companies carried a Winchester instead of a Springfield. Would they have survived? They certainly could have fired more quickly. During the opening minutes, denser fire might have slowed the approaching warriors. Some attackers may have been forced to keep their distance. Positions such as Calhoun Hill might have held longer. Groups attempting to retreat could have created a stronger curtain of fire as they moved between the ridgelines. But repeating firearms also consumed ammunition more quickly. Once the magazines were empty, the soldiers still had to reload. The reserve ammunition still remained behind. Reno was still driven back. Benteen still did not know Custer's exact location. The village was still larger than expected. The ravine still concealed the approaching warriors, and the 5 companies still faced a force many times larger than their own. Winchesters might have prolonged the battle. They might have increased casualties on the opposing side. They might have helped some men break through and escape. But there is no firm evidence that they would have reversed the entire outcome. That is what people often overlook when they turn technology into the answer to everything. A better gun might help a soldier remain alive for a few more minutes. It cannot restore communications by itself. It cannot reunite a regiment by itself. It cannot correct a mistaken estimate of enemy strength. And it cannot replace a retreat plan that was never clearly organized. Custer's personal guns could not change the outcome. Custer may have carried a 50-70 Remington Rolling Block. He may have possessed 2 British double-action revolvers. He may have entered the battle with personal weapons better than those carried by most of the soldiers under his command. But once the circle closed, that no longer meant very much. A 50-70 bullet could bring down 1 man or 1 horse. 2 revolvers could give him several more shots before reloading, but each bullet could deal with only 1 target. Custer was not facing 1 target. He was facing a battlefield that was collapsing. Suppose every shot he fired struck its mark. Suppose the Remington functioned perfectly. Suppose both revolvers were fully loaded. His personal guns still could not rebuild the companies that had collapsed to the south. They could not bring the ammunition train closer. They could not see through the terrain. They could not turn dead men into a new defensive line. The legend often focuses on the final bullet because it transforms a disaster into a personal story. 1 man, 1 gun, 1 moment of courage. But Little Bighorn was not the failure of 1 bullet. It was the failure of a command system that no longer functioned when it was needed most. What archaeology actually proved? Archaeology did not uncover a satisfying answer. It did not return Custer's final gun. It did not identify a bullet fired by Custer himself. It did not reveal exactly who died first or who remained alive during the final seconds. But it accomplished something more important. It shattered the image of a motionless defensive circle. Cartridge cases showed that firearms moved across several positions. The distribution of artifacts showed that groups of soldiers became separated. The terrain demonstrated that native warriors could approach through concealed ground. Unfired cartridges found beside collapsed positions showed that some soldiers did not die because they had completely exhausted their ammunition. They died before they could use the ammunition they still had. That changes the way we see the battle. Custer's entire force did not fire its last rounds at the same time and then become overwhelmed all at once. Some positions were broken first. Survivors withdrew toward other positions. Some attempted to run north. Some were intercepted along the way. Eventually, the remaining small groups could no longer support one another. It was a collapse, not one prolonged heroic pose. The final verdict. Did Custer lose because of his weapons? Yes, but not in the way the popular story usually claims. The Springfield fired more slowly than some of the enemy's repeating firearms. During close-range combat, that was a genuine disadvantage. Leaving the sabers behind made the soldiers more dependent on ammunition when the fighting moved closer. The reserve ammunition positioned in the rear made their ability to continue fighting increasingly fragile. Some Lakota and Cheyenne warriors carried weapons better suited to rapid fire at short range. But Custer did not lose only because of those differences. He lost because his formation was divided, because his information was incomplete, because he misjudged the size of the opposing force, because the terrain concealed critical movements, because native forces concentrated more quickly than he expected, and because powerful Springfield carbines became isolated weapons in the hands of men who were no longer fighting as a unified force. In other words, weapons helped determine the battle. But Custer determined the conditions under which those weapons had to fight. The final gun is not the greatest mystery. From Gettysburg to Little Bighorn, the weapons under Custer's command changed along with America. At Gettysburg, some Michigan soldiers used 7-shot Spencers repeating firearms that helped produce rapid fire as Stuart's cavalry advanced. At Washita, the 7th Cavalry Regiment carried a combat system consisting of Spencer's percussion revolvers and sabers. Those 3 layers of weapons allowed them to move from long-range fire to close combat during the pre-dawn attack. By Yellowstone, we begin to see Custer not only as a commander, but also as a man who loved firearms. He wrote about his personal Springfield. He evaluated the Winchester. He praised the 50-70 Remington Rolling Block. But the story of Tuttle reminds us that a gun belonging to Custer was not necessarily fired by Custer. The Army later replaced the older Spencers with the Springfield Model 1873. It was a powerful and accurate carbine, but it held only 1 cartridge. This was not the foolish decision many people imagine. It reflected the need for standardization logistics and the military thinking of the era. But at Little Bighorn, every advantage of that system was dragged into the worst possible conditions. The distance narrowed, the formations collapsed, the reserve ammunition remained behind, the enemy approached through concealed terrain, and the soldiers were no longer close enough to protect one another during the gaps required for reloading. What about Custer's personal weapons? We know that he owned many guns: the pearl-gripped Smith & Wessons, the old Sharps, the Creedmoor target rifle, the sporting Springfield, the 50-70 Remington Rolling Block, and possibly 2 British double-action revolvers. But just because a gun sat inside Custer's cabinet does not mean it ever entered a battlefield. Just because it accompanied the campaign does not mean Custer personally fired it. And just because a bullet is the correct caliber does not mean it belonged to him. Those are the 3 boundaries that legend constantly tries to erase. Even today, we still do not know which gun was in Custer's hands when he was wounded. We do not know how many shots he fired. We do not know whether his final bullet was a 50-70, a 4.42, or something else. We do not even know whether he was still capable of fighting during the final minutes. But perhaps that is not the most important mystery. The greater mystery is why America needed the image of Custer standing alone, firing a gun in each hand until his final bullet. Perhaps because that image was easier to accept than the truth. An overwhelmed hero sounds tragic. A commander who misjudged the situation, divided his force, and lost control sounds like a failure. And America in 1876 needed a legend more than it needed an investigation. But the ground does not care about legends. It preserves cartridge cases where they fell. It preserves bullets inside bones. It preserves unfired cartridges in the soil around the dead. More than a century later, those traces force us to see Custer not as a perfect hero or a simple incompetent, but as a bold and experienced commander who understood firearms, trusted speed, and was ultimately convinced by his own past victories that he could advance one more time. At Gettysburg, recklessness helped turn him into a legend. At Washita, it delivered a deeply controversial victory. At Yellowstone, he still lived to describe his own shots. But at Little Bighorn, no one beside him survived to tell the final version. Only the guns and ammunition remained beneath the ground. And now there is a question for you. Suppose Custer had not carried single-shot Springfields. Suppose all 5 companies had been equipped with Winchesters. Do you believe they could have broken through the encirclement and survived? Or would the outcome have remained the same because even the best gun on the battlefield could not save a force that had already been divided? Leave your answer in the comments below. The Battle of Little Bighorn may have ended in 1876, but the debate over what truly destroyed Custer's command has never ended. And if you believe this was already the greatest secret buried beneath the battlefield, remember that the cartridge cases did more than reveal how Custer's men fired. They also showed that his formation collapsed in a sequence completely different from the image of the last stand that America believed for more than a century.